John, it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you. We're here to talk about your conference, which of course has to do with belonging and othering, and also what does it mean to bridge differences. How is that possible? What are its conditions? And also breaking. What happens when a bridge falls down, or one finds oneself having to break with a community on matters of principle. These are anguished and promising concepts, and I'm wondering if you'd talk to us a little bit about what you have in mind.
Well, Judith, you're right, and it's always a delight to be in conversation with you. I always find it insightful and always walk away having learned something new, so I anticipate that today as well. These are really very important concepts, especially in today's world where we're not just polarizing and breaking, and othering is an expression of that. Othering basically suggests, for whatever reason, someone is not a full member. They're not accorded a full dignity. They're less than. And at the extreme, we see them as a threat. And when we do that, we actually tend to flatten people. People are complex, but when we other people, we see them as two-dimensional. They're just one thing, and that one thing is bad. And we say that the solution to othering, which is happening all over the world, is not saming, but belonging. And belonging is where you not only show up in your full self with all your multiple identities, but you also show up as a full participant. You get to co-create the very thing that you're joining or you're part of. And we're clear at the Institute that we're calling for belonging without othering. So sometimes a group constitutes itself in opposition to another group. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, can we have a radical belonging where there is no othering? And again, I think our work is very close to how I understand some of your work. And one of the processes of doing that of connecting with people who are apparently other, and most of those othering categories, if not all of them, are really social. They're not natural. There's no natural other. And so it changes from society to society. And it changes from situation to situation. And we're calling on people to be willing to bridge, to be willing to affirmatively connect with someone who apparently is other.
Yeah, let's talk about bridging. Is bridging a way of reaching out across differences? Is it a way of overcoming maybe fear or anxiety, or overcoming prejudices in some way? How do you, can you talk about examples of bridging, or can you tell us what this term does for you?
Yeah, so bridging actually engages, right? And in that engagement, it doesn't mean that our differences go away. It doesn't mean we agree with each other. It doesn't mean we even like each other, but it means we respect each other. We hear each other's stories. And what we know in terms of process, one of the strong ways to bridge is to listen to someone else's story. The idea of compassion means to suffer with. So am I willing to listen to your story of suffering as well as your aspiration? And a lot of the work in the United States around bridging was informed by Robert Putnam. But Putnam's approach to these questions was largely in the context of where power was not central, and largely between groups, between individuals. So when you have power being critical, and it's not individuals that are at odds with each other, but it's groups, it's a very different phenomenon. And the risk of bridging when you're part of a group is a greater risk. And one risk is that if you reach out to those other people over there, we're going to kick you out the group.
Right. I mean, groups fall apart on the question of whether or not they should bridge.
Exactly.
So I was speaking with a group of feminists actually in Kurdistan, who were saying that they needed to stay focused on their own issues because they were afraid of losing strength by forming alliances.
Right.
And I tried to point out that perhaps there was greater strength in the alliance, and I saw that there was a division of opinion. Of course, I can't tell them what to do from the outside, but I did try to suggest that maybe the attack on women, which is central to their issues, was related to the attack on gay, lesbian, trans people, and maybe that too is related to the attack on the environment, or the destruction of their villages, and maybe an anti-war stance. So it was a complex. It was a complex conversation, but I saw the fear that they would lose strength. And they're a very powerful group. They're an amazing group, and I didn't want to take their power away. But they were afraid that maybe I did.
I think that's important. And one of the things, of course, is that a lot of people who are concerned about power, and to some extent maybe all of us are, feel that if they acknowledge the other group, as you said, it might take their power away. On the other hand, if we're continuing to fracture into smaller and smaller groups, that diminishes power substantially. So even strategically, there's reasons to at least explore bridging.
Yes.
And if it doesn't work, you can always walk away from it. You asked for an example. One of my favorite examples, of course, is Nelson Mandela. When Nelson Mandela met with the head of the South African army in the middle of the fight, and this general was an avowed racist, explicit. He called black people monkeys. He didn't want to meet with Nelson Mandela, but he had to. So it's like he was performing. I'll go meet with him, but I don't, we can win this war. Black people can never rule this country over my dead body. But he met with Nelson Mandela at his home. And I won't go through the whole thing, but it's chronicled now. Nelson Mandela did so much bridging. He served the General T, and he had servants, but he served him himself. He sat next to the general on a couch. There was a chair across, which made the general extremely uncomfortable.
I bet.
And then once they started the negotiation, the entire negotiation took place in Afrikaner.
I see.
Which is the general's home language.
Of course.
And so he was acknowledging the sacred symbols of the general. And some people say, well, that's wrong. You're giving up your power. But I think he was acting out of power. And when the general left the meeting, all of his entourage rushed up to him and said, did you tell that Nelson Mandela off? And the general's response was, I don't know if I like this Nelson Mandela guy, but he can convince anyone of anything. We're going to have a peace treaty.
Okay.
And they did. And later, just to round out the story, when Nelson Mandela stepped down, the general asked if he could speak at Nelson Mandela's ceremony. And Nelson Mandela's family and friends still didn't like this general. This is years later. But they said, you got 10 minutes. And the general comes to the podium, and he tries to give the speech in Xhosa, which is Nelson Mandela's native language. And he was trying to bridge. So the interesting thing is, Nelson Mandela still had his army. He still had guns. He still had freedom fighters. He hadn't given any of that up. He still had all the power he walked into the meeting with. So, and there are many other examples. And I don't claim to be Nelson Mandela, who is, except Nelson Mandela.
But he's an important inspiration for you and your project.
That's right.
When I was growing up, there was skepticism about peacemaking because there was a memory, or at least a history of various Allied powers trying to meet with Hitler in Munich, and and of course he would make agreements and then break them, or Khrushchev announcing socialism with a human face and vowing never to invade Hungary, and then of course invading Hungary within about 8 months. So, I mean, sometimes people say things in negotiations that turn out to be lies, or and make the other person in the negotiation, the other group, feel like fools. Like, why did I ever trust? What do you say to people who have those kinds of histories to tell?
Well, and I think many marginalized groups and groups who are under attack have those histories. And I talk about short bridges and long bridges. And oftentimes when you talk about bridging, people who like the idea conceptually but not in practice, they go to the most extreme. Like, if I'm Jewish, how do I bridge with a Nazi? If I'm gay or lesbian, how do I, bridge with a conservative Christian who believes that my identity is against the will of God?
Yeah.
If I'm black, how do I bridge with a white supremacist, Proud Boys, or Promise Keepers? And I said, don't start there. Don't start with the most difficult.
Yeah.
Start closer at home.
I see.
And get better.
Uh-huh.
And you'll learn something.
Yeah.
And we're not suggesting that people become, fools. People are complicated.
Yeah.
And there's some things we can do to help create a container. But also what I would tell them is to read Judith Butler. Because when you talk about nonviolence, and I want you to, if you comment on this, when you look at people's justification for not engaging in nonviolence, and one is that, well, I have a right of self-defense. And as I recall, your response is, how do you define the self? If we don't define the self as a isolated, freestanding, autonomous being, but a self in relationship, that question becomes much more complicated.
Yeah.
So how do we have relationships with people who are, quote unquote, radically different than us, who are on the verge of attacking us? So how would you answer that?
Yes. Well, many people do say, why should I practice nonviolence in relationship to someone who wants me dead, or wants my people dead, or who has very explicitly articulated genocidal intentions toward me and my people, whoever my people may be.
Right.
It's always a tenuous question. But I think that there's maybe a point here that we have to decide whether we want to make the world a more violent place or a less violent place. And I'm not saying I wouldn't intervene to stop someone from doing harm to someone close to me. I probably would. I even think there are forms of intervention and blockage that belong to nonviolence, so stopping another person's violence from doing destruction. But the question, even for barricades or human chains that are meant to block destruction or violence, is how do we distinguish between the force of an intervention and the force of violence? And I just want to say, hold that line. Ask yourself that question. I can't draw that line for somebody else, but I can say, ask that question, go into the scene of conflict with that question. How do I engage here without replicating the violence of those I wish to stop? And I think, nonviolence is not passivity. It's not compliance. It's not letting other people run over you. But if someone's trying to run over you, how can you block them?
Right.
And so blockage is important. And certain we've seen that in public assemblies and demonstrations. Sometimes we see people who block the police from doing further damage. Those are strong positions, but they can be nonviolent.
Right.
And I just want us to hold the line. It is true that in my view, I am a social creature. I can't really even understand myself without the relationships that brought me into being, or that sustained me, or that I in turn sustain. That includes social and environmental relationships, really, and infrastructural ones. So what gets attacked when someone attacks me, or my social bonds, or if I attack someone else, I say I have no bond with you, or I seek to destroy that bond that I have with you. But in fact, the bond is there, otherwise I wouldn't be trying to destroy it.
Right.
And maybe I could destroy that bond or this bond, but I can't destroy the fact that we exist through and we are sustained by a series of social bonds. So for me, preserving social bonds and sustaining them and cultivating them so that they are based on equality and an equal commitment to freedom and an aspiration of justice is the only way to go. And for me, it's also transnational. It's not bounded within smaller communities or nations, but it actually has to be a global, if not planetary, commitment.
Right. I think that your work you're doing is so important, and I think it's actually quite beautiful and quite radical. And I just want to pull out another thread of it, because the way I read you, and I may be misunderstanding you, is that you're saying we are connected to everyone and everything, including the earth itself. And that when we do violence or breaking to the other, we're actually injuring ourselves. And still we might have to do stuff, but we want to do that very judiciously. It's not something we rush to. So how does that work for you in practice? Because I know you've been attacked by a lot of groups over many years. And so someone who doesn't believe in equality of the different races, doesn't believe in people who have different sexual orientation, doesn't believe that certain people are, as you would say, deserving or grievable. So when you meet someone who is in an organized way, not just as an individual, but as part of a group that rejects the humanity of another group, how do you hold on to that interconnection, that grievability?
Yeah, it can be very difficult, being burned in effigy in Brazil. I have fear, right? I have fear of that attack recurring, and there are certain places in the world that are not so easy for me to go anymore because of a kind of right-wing anti-gender ideology movement that has identified me as one of the core forces of destruction. And what I have apparently destroyed with the concept of gender is man and civilization, humanity and God, and nature and science. So that's a lot of destruction that I'm responsible for. And it's very hard, obviously, to be deeply hated and to have people wanting you dead. It's very hard, but it gets easier when you're part of a collective that is asserting the dignity of our common life in the face of those who would deny that.
Well, let me just ask one more question on this. What about the leftists? Many people who come to our conference, not all, our conference is open to everyone, and we hope everyone feels welcome and a sense of belonging. But we know we probably tilt more toward the progressive left. My reading of your life and your work is that some of the people who've gone after you are not the far right, but the far left. People who we might think of as almost natural allies. Some of the people who have othered you are people who were part of your community for various reasons. And then, of course, there's also the thing that you carry multiple identities, right? Like we all do.
Yes.
But sometimes those identities, people think they don't line up right. So how can a Jewish lesbian be in favor of Palestine state?
Yeah.
Is that anti-Semitic? Aren't you attacking Jews? So how do you deal with that?
Well, I think with patience, I like the long form. I like the idea that I don't tweet. I'm not on social media, but I like the situations where we can have a long conversation, or I can write a long form piece that patiently lays it out, so that I can shift the disagreement to another kind of register. And I think I've developed more calm in relationship to attacks like those. Whether I can speak in a certain way, or whether I've gone far enough in my politics, or whether I've gone too far in my politics. I also take the criticism sometimes from the left, like, oh, okay, I need to think about that now. Thank you. So some criticisms are challenging and allow me to revise the work I did 30 some years ago in gender trouble is no longer the work I would do now, and that's in part because my critics were pretty good.
Well, but just a point of clarity, I'm not suggesting the problem with people criticizing you.
Yeah.
I'm suggesting people is putting you out of the community,
Yeah.
basically othering you, basically saying,
Well,
Judith, if you can do that, you can't be part
you're
of the
out.
group.
Well, here's the thing. they put me out. Like, okay, like the ultra-Zionists will put me out. Like, we can't have Judith Butler speaking, or we can't acknowledge this work, or we can't permit someone to speak in the way that I speak. At the same time, they also use me, or others like me, who as a limit test, right? So they also give me a certain kind of power by putting me out there. You know, it's like, oh, we can't have Judith Butler. It's like, oh, okay, Judith Butler you can't have, right? So then that gives me a platform, right? It's like, oh, thank you. You actually acknowledge me in the effort not to acknowledge me. You said my name. You indicated some knowledge of what my position is. You may have gotten it totally wrong, but by addressing me, you inadvertently made me into a speaker.
Yeah, it's true.
There was a woman in Switzerland, a conservative Catholic woman, who came up to me and said, I pray for you. I said, oh, I don't think you have to pray for me. I think I'm okay. And she said, no, I pray for you. And I said, why? Why do you pray for me? Because of what you write. It attacks the Bible. She had fear. And she was afraid her way of life was being destroyed. And I saw that in Brazil as well. People were afraid something was happening to their children. They were afraid that the family as they knew it was being destroyed, that the nation as they knew it was being destroyed. And so calming it down, what is this destruction? What is just because your next door neighbor is a gay couple with a kid doesn't mean your heteronormative family is threatened. You're just living adjacent to another kind of family. That adjacency shouldn't be a threat to your life. The only thing it's really a threat to is your sense that I occupy the exclusive and only possible social form of the family. It's like, well, yes, you do have to suffer that loss. You have to live in a world in which that's no longer the case, and it's actually never been the case. You know, family structures change through history, kinship structures change according to migration, according to slavery and its aftermath. I mean, we know kinship is historical and very complex. So, yeah, they can't live in that with that belief that their way of life is the only possible way of life. They have to mourn that loss. But I do think that if one listens even to the most hateful rhetoric, you hear other things like enormous anxiety and fear, and a sense that they will be killed if they do not kill. So how did people get in that position? And calming it down and trying to look beneath some of that to find out what the deep anxieties are. And of course, we're also living in a media world where people want to stoke those anxieties, and they do so sometimes through circulations of pernicious falsehoods. So taking a chance to learn and to listen and to engage the long form, whether it's conversation or writing or film or another media. I really believe in that.
Well, I believe in it as well. I think, in addition, we can actually arrange processes and structures that support bringing people together. But we more likely arrange processes and structures that keep people apart.
Yeah.
But I want to return just to one other thing you said about the fear, because that seems something that's distributed across all groups, right? And that may be a bridge, just that, okay, I'm afraid of you and you're afraid of me.
Yeah.
And it might be that the fear is unfounded, but it doesn't matter, I have it. It might be that the fear is founded. And so when you think of groups, certainly when you think of the trauma that marginalized groups experience, and then they come up against the Zionists or the Catholic Church or the Proud Boys or Antifa, right? I mean, there's this fear that both groups are experiencing. And I'm not saying they're symmetrical.
Yeah.
Because some groups can call the state, call the police, and some groups cannot.
That's for sure.
But that common fear, that common anxiety, that common sense of possible loss, that you're going to actually destroy my world, there may be something there that we could actually create some empathy around, some passion around.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about that?
Well, some fear is not manageable, like there's something we could call an unmanageable anxiety or an unmanageable fear, like a fear you have that for which there is no obvious way to assuage it, and then that converts into aggression, right? It converts into anger and the need to destroy. But also, you know, many people do feel quite abandoned by the economy or by government structures, electoral democracy, healthcare, whatever economic hopes they may have once had are dashed, or promises they thought were made to them were destroyed. And, so if there's no place to turn, right? There's no place to turn. That's when I think that the anxiety, or maybe what we could better call fear, does end up in a kind of militia-like, have to take matters into our own hands. So, I mean, I've also, you know, had discussions with a number of people who thought, well, given the Proud Boys and the violence against black people in this country, that black people should take up arms. And there have been a number of podcasts on and media reports on the number of people, black, brown, and white, who are buying guns now, which I think is a sign that people don't believe that there are reliable structures of power, reliable structures of adjudication to which they can turn, that we're all on our own. So the answer to that has got to be to rebuild infrastructures of care at a very deep level, not only healthcare and social services, but, you know, maybe like guaranteed income or workable political structures, so that people feel that they live in a world where their lives are valued. So, you know, it's sometimes we have to turn to those larger questions in order to build a different ethos and a different way of looking out for one another or caring for each other's lives.
Well, I think that's certainly right, and it seems to me that part of that anxiety and fear, though, is not just people come to that conclusion on their own, that they are encouraged.
Yes, they are.
By the elites and by the powerful. I talked to a group of conservative white Republicans, I think it was in Alabama, in rural Alabama, about the Affordable Care Act. They were trying to get Medicare exemption, so they could, and the people were extremely hostile. And what they were hostile to was not just the act, they were hostile to also having a black man, probably liberal, from Berkeley. You know, it's like all the tropes, right? It's like, you know, it's like, you don't understand us, we don't like you. And I started off by not talking about the Affordable Care Act, and I was talking about extending it to everybody, blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, disabled people. Anyway, the upshot of it, instead of going there, you should support this because all these groups need it, I asked them about their own experience with insurance, their experience of having a sick child and having their insurance cut off, their experience of losing their job and having their insurance terminated, the experience of the doctor ordering something and the insurance company saying no. And a few more questions like that, and I literally 400 people, everybody was like up in arms, no arms were folded anymore. And all of a sudden, I was not the other. I was carrying a message that resonated. I was amplifying their own message. And then I pivoted. I said that same thing is happening in the black community, in the gay community, in all these communities that, and I didn't lose one person. Because
that's great.
Their own story was part of the story. And their own story was not them just being racist villains. It was them suffering. So I remember that, and they said, we hope you come back. And I said, well, I don't think anytime soon, but it seems to me that there's certain malleability, that people have positions, but those positions are not necessarily deep. And if they can be respected, if they can be heard, if they can know that we care about each other, I care about you, that sometimes that can create an opening. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, I guess my comment is actually a question, which is, are there ever times when you walk out?
Want to walk out?
You walk out. When you're having a conversation, you walk out.
Sure. And to your earlier point, to me, bridging is aspirational. Belonging is aspirational. So there's a book I'm reading now, and I just finished it actually, by Amanda Ripley, called High Conflict. And she talks about conflict is necessary, but high conflict is something else. And it's a kind of othering. It's where, again, we're a danger to each other. We don't see each other. If someone's a danger to me, I'm not going to stay around. Like your point, if I can't lower the threat,
Yeah.
I'm leaving.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And sometimes the threat is really out there. Sometimes it's in my own head. You know, and sometimes it's hard to disentangle those. But I think there are conditions associated with bridging.
Yes.
There are conditions associated with activating or reaching out to the other.
Yeah.
And I think, from my perspective, the liberals tend to ignore those conditions altogether. It's like, it's all interpersonal. We can all talk to anyone.
Yeah.
Can talk to anyone. Well, that's certainly not true.
Yeah.
Progressives tend to exaggerate the conditions. It's like, after we get rid of capitalism, after we get rid of the homosexuality, homophobia,
yeah.
after we get rid of, you know, all these things, then
we can talk.
Then we can talk. It's forever postponing the talk.
Right.
And I think both are problematic. That we can have a conversation and with some guardrails, but not too many.
Yeah. John, you've talked about compassion and listening, and patience with the other. What about courage, and what about taking risks? How does that figure into your thinking and the thinking of the conference more generally?
To your point earlier about power, right? I think that the idea of bridging, and I really love the idea that we're, not just the idea, the reality, we're radically interconnected. We don't live that way, we don't talk that way, but it's there. So we're trying to, and it's a healthy way.
The pandemic shows us that we are.
Exactly.
Right?
And how do we do that in a non-hierarchical, deeply dignified way? And to not do that, to me, is a risk. So to not bridge is a risk. And yes, when I bridge, when I listen to someone else, when I expose my own vulnerability, Adrienne B. Brown talks about this a lot. Yeah, there's a risk. The person might use it, the person might, you know, it may not be anything except disrespect, which is still injury. So I would say, that's why I say start with shorter bridges, but take a risk. And in training, they oftentimes saying there are three rings. One is complete comfort and safety. One is a stretch, where I'm going beyond my comfort level. I'm trying something different. And then your point in terms of unmanageable anxiety or fear or trauma. So that third area we want to stay out of. But also we don't want to spend too much time in that first area.
Yeah.
We're not asking people to come take a nap.
Right.
You know, you can do that at home.
Yeah.
We're asking you to do something because not only does the world need it, we need it. We all need, I think our humanity is enhanced the more we can not only bridge with the other, but bridge with different parts of ourselves. Because I think when we start cutting off, mutating the other, we end up mutating parts of ourselves.
So we can become other to ourselves?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
And you see it. I mean, someone's like, I did an experiment years ago in one of my classes, and I asked students, because I was teaching at University of Minnesota, and I said, how many of you have ever dreamt you were an inanimate object or an animal? And you know, it's like 100 students, everybody say, yeah. I said, what were you? I was a rock. And you know, and what were you? I was an eagle soaring overhead.
Wow.
What were you? I was the river flowing.
Wow.
I said, great. And I said, so how many of you have ever dreamt, this was mainly white students at the University of Minnesota, and I said, how many of you have ever dreamt you were a black woman? Not one hand went up. Not one hand. And I said, don't you think that's odd? And they said, I'm not a black woman. And I said, you're not a rock either.
You're not a river.
Exactly. And in a sense, to me, they were cutting off part of themselves.
Oh, it's like a disidentification.
Exactly.
Right.
And one student called me up 5 years later. He said, Professor Powell, can I take you to lunch? I'm in town and I've graduated. I said, sure. And he said, I want to tell you something. I said, what's that? He said, I have a therapist, and I haven't told my therapist this. I'm married, I haven't told my wife this. You're the first person I'm telling this. I said, what is that? He said, you know that experiment you had of us dreaming into different identities? I said, yeah. He said, I dreamed I was gay. But I'm not. 5 years, right? And it was significant enough, he wanted to tell me, but he hadn't told his therapist, right? So to me, it's saying...
He trusted you with that.
Well, he trusted me, but how hard it was for him to start integrating that part of himself into his larger self.
Yeah. And what about, I mean, the problem, of course, is that many people will say, look, you've not had the experience of a black woman. You can't speak for us. You can't know. You don't have the epistemological grounding to make claims. You can join the struggle against racism, but don't be speaking as me or thinking that you can, through an act of empathy, identify with me completely, because that's not true. That's not your history. My history is different from yours. So where does that kind of...
That's a great question, and I've written about this and frankly citing some of your work. I think that the danger, especially now, frankly on the left and maybe on the right, is we're sort of falling, I think, into an uncritical essentialism again. And we don't quite understand the boundaries of experience. Experience matter, but they're not everything. And our capacity to grow, our capacity to change. And so what I would say is you add up all a person's experience and there's still something else. And yet those experiences matter. And our capacity to connect, our capacity to love, and certainly no two people have, not just people of different races, no two people have the same experience. But the very nature of connecting with someone, not to consume their identity, not to consume their voice, but to actually dig at something deeper, and that shared experience creates something new. So, you know, I worked in South Africa for a while, and blacks in South Africa, the 12 or 13 different tribes, they got moved to the city under apartheid, and, you know, basically under apartheid, trying to keep the different tribes separate, created a new racial identity. The very coming together created something different. And you can't predict what that exactly is. I mean, I know you have I think, a pretty wonderful relationship. You have a relationship with someone, you love someone, you care about someone, you're not the same.
Yes, that's true.
You know, it changes you.
You are transformed by your relationships. I totally agree.
So we don't have to mimic being someone else, but we have to be open, I think, to a different set of possibilities, not only with ourselves, but with the world. I mean, the fact that we are in California and we're dealing with climate change, the fact that we're dealing with smoke in the air, the fact that the earth is shifting, this is, you know, Darwin. We are changing. And so I respect the importance of identity, but I don't want to make it a categorical block.
But maybe it's something that has to be negotiated, right? I mean, if I try to join a struggle against racism, as a white person, I have to be mindful of how people who are directly suffering the effects of racism have formulated their struggle, right? So I can't arrive as the leader. I can't be telling people what their experience is. Right? Some people on the left have thought that. I mean, that's the old problem with the left, right? Where it's like, oh, we have the big frame, and we'll tell you where your social movement fits. You've got a secondary oppression, you've got a tertiary oppression over there.
No, I completely agree.
Right? So we didn't really like that.
But I want to go back to one of my favorite writers, Judith Butler, who talks about, right, that in terms of our profound interconnectedness. Right? So one of the ways, I just taught a class recently on critical race theory, and I was reading Derek Bell, who was a good friend of mine. He's passed away, one of the architects of critical race, and he talks about whites critiquing critical race theory. Right? And to me, there's an appropriate critique, and there's an appropriation that's inappropriate. And you don't want to create a discipline and say, whites can never talk about this because you haven't been black. But if we say race, which we do in some feminist theory, right, is profoundly interconnected. So the white experience, and this is why James Baldwin says there's no hope for them as long as they think they're white. So what does he mean by that? That the very construction of white has to be challenged.
Yeah.
And that's not just a project for black people.
No.
That's a project for all of us.
Yes. No, it's true. I think Claudia Rankine has that in mind with her Institute for the Racial Imaginary and trying to think about whiteness. Like, let's talk about whiteness.
And of course, I mean, like here in California, but one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing group in the country, it's not Latinos, it's not Asians, it's certainly not blacks, it's multiracial, multi-ethnic. And they don't fit easily in any of those categories.
Yeah.
So families, I think somewhere before 2030, more than half of the new family formations in California will have someone multiracial, multi-ethnic.
Yeah.
So where do they fit, right? They're constantly rejuggling these categories.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing, right? But
well, sometimes I think categories do too much work. Like, I could say I am a this and a that and the other, but you wouldn't really know what my relationship to any of those categories are if I just assert them.
Right.
Like, maybe you need a story from me. Maybe we need we need a narrative, or a description, or some more complex way of understanding how I live that in the world and how other people do.
Right.
But we need to use different media for that. We can't just assert identity and assume
That's right,
that
exactly.
we know what that means. Sometimes it's a block, or it's a challenge. Like, you're going to deal with me as this? Like, how are you going to deal with me as this? And that can be a way of being in relationship, not breaking it or cutting it off, but there are some conditions, like how are you going to deal with that?
So earlier you talked about the heteronormative family living next door.
Yes.
And the thing they would have to give up is their right to be exclusive.
Yes.
And to essentially dominate.
And
right?
dominant.
And so, in a sense, then, they're right that you are changing their sense of the world.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
but you're saying, yes, but it could be a better world. You're in the world. I'm not saying go away. I'm not saying you're evil, die.
Yeah.
I'm saying there's a world where all of us belong.
Yes, but isn't it interesting how often people think that extending equality will be the destruction of their lives?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very strange resistance to the whole idea of equality. It's like,
Right.
oh no, if we're equal, then we're interchangeable. Then the singularity and dominance of my form of life will be challenged, and I will
That's exactly.
I will die.
And that's why I say that the solution to othering is not saming.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the fear that the way to become, the way to get rid of othering is that all of us are the same. And that's the liberal response. It's like, gays are just like straight people, except maybe they do love a little differently, but they're just the same. It's like, well, maybe they're not just the same.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
Do I have to be you in order to be treated with dignity, to have something to contribute?
Right.
And so I think that it's much more complicated.
It
than
is
nuanced.
complicated.
And your point in terms of, yes, I'm a black man, but I'm also a father, I'm also tall, I'm also old, I'm also a vegetarian, I'm also, it's not completely malleable, but identities are shifting, and they shift in part because of our interaction with each other. And going back to your earlier point in terms of, that doesn't mean that I should lead, the transgender movement. It doesn't mean that I should lead the women's movement. It doesn't mean, but it also means I'm not categorically the infinite distance. Yeah. It's the infinite other doesn't exist, but it doesn't mean we're the same. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Judith, and this is really great. The time went by too fast. Yeah. And I hope we do it again. And I think certainly I continue to learn from you. And just one sort of underlying point, I think your things in terms of us being radically connected and caring about each other. I mean, I think there's a word for that. It's called love. Yeah. And I wanted to make sure we at least acknowledge that we're reimagining love in the world. Yeah. And your work for me is a really beautiful articulation of that. So
well,
thank you.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate it. As you know, love is hard. It comes with conflict and difficulty. So, that's part of the struggle.